wow, you've been doing this for 2.5 years already. Aren't you tired? When do you think you're going to stop? Have you decided where you're going to settle down? And there are no concrete answers to that question yet, partly because I've had a really extraordinary time. I've enjoyed this shift in life so much. I do not miss having a single apartment. People are often like, oh, don't you miss your bed and your things and your kitchen? Like when I think about what home is to me, home is very much my people. Where they are, where they're gathered, that is where I feel comfortable, that's where I feel at ease. And my people are everywhere. The other thing that it's made me realize is that the world can be so small. I think for me, the idea of like perpetual travel without a fixed end date is much more feasible, much more sustainable. Like to have the sense that home is literally everywhere is such a precious gift. Like, you know what? Now I have the choice. Winter's a choice. I don't have to do this, and I'm not going to. Oh my gosh, I knew you were going to get me with this question. Yeah, do everything? Are you sure?
All right. Well, Rachel, welcome to the SAFAROTO podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you in this episode. Let me take a couple of minutes to maybe do a little introduction and
Perfect.
jump into your story and your travel lifestyle over the last couple of years.
Sounds excellent.
Wonderful. So Rachel and I have met back on May 21st, 2017.
17.
I went back on my calendar and I looked at the date. We went out dancing, spent some time on the dance floor together
Mhm.
in Seattle almost 8 years ago now. Since then, we have traveled together across 3 different continents, spent a bunch of time together in South America, some time together in North Africa, in Europe, and I'm looking forward to many more adventures together in different parts of the world.
Very much so. It's terrifying to think that this is almost 8 years ago now.
Time
my
flies.
God. Time flies. And I remember very specifically, it was the 90s night at the Lo-Fi. Even the club doesn't exist anymore. That's how long ago this was.
Fun times, fun times. We actually also spent a bunch of time together in California, as well as in Seattle. Have we
Yeah.
connected in New York at a certain point? I can't remember.
I don't think we've ever met in New York.
Yeah.
We can
Well,
work on that
we'll
though.
make it happen this summer, as we had talked about before.
We could. This is very possible. Yeah, so I guess 4 continents so far. Okay, not bad. Not bad. We got a couple more to go. I think we can make this happen.
Wonderful. I look forward to it. So, Rachel, I know when we met, you were living in Seattle, having a fairly traditional lifestyle, I may say. You had your job, you had that wonderful house where we got to hang out with a bunch of friends all the time. But now you travel full time. You're spending your time in different countries.
Yeah.
So why don't you take a step back and maybe share with us a little bit about how you transition from living a more sedentary lifestyle to more of your current digital nomad lifestyle?
Very happy to share. And this story actually begins much earlier than 2017, much earlier than my traditional job, because travel has really been a part of my family's story for a long time. So my family is mostly from Ghana. I have 3 Ghanaian grandparents, 1 American grandparent who moved to West Africa in the 1950s and spent his time in Ghana and Tanzania for most of the rest of his life. And then my parents moved from Ghana to the US, to Washington State, which is where I was born. And I grew up between Washington and Jamaica and Ghana, going back and forth. So I've always been a traveler. Visiting family in my childhood was not about going down the street to your auntie's house. It was about flying 3 flights, 24 hours, thousands of miles to go and see your grandmother on another continent. So I became accustomed very early to building community across continents, across cultures, knowing that my loved ones would never be in the same place. So travel would always be a part of our family building and community nurturing journey. So I set that as the baseline because I think it is a somewhat different situation for me as a full-time traveler than for many other people. That travel, in many ways, is a community grounding practice. That's how I get the chance to spend time with my loved ones, to be with my dear friends, to be in community. So fast forward, when I met you, I was 5 years into my Seattle journey. So as you said, I was there full time, had my office job, I was commuting to Bellevue across the lake every day, living in this shared house, building a wonderful community there. And it was an exciting time. I enjoyed many things about Seattle, but I'd always felt that pull to explore other cities and again to spend time with the dear loved ones who were scattered all over the world. So I did a first test trip in 2018. I think you and I saw each other in Morocco that year, where I took 5.5 months to travel around the world. So I left my full-time job, visited, I think I went straight to Ghana at that time, visited family, traveled continents. I was, my goodness, in Greece, I was in Senegal, I was in Ghana, I was in the UK, went all over the world, came back to Seattle and started working remotely for the first time. And this was pre-COVID. So the world hadn't quite adjusted to the remote work lifestyle yet, but some folks were early adopters. So I started doing that. And then 2019 was a fantastic Seattle year. And then 2020 happened. And we all know what that was like. So suddenly finding yourself constrained to one place, and not just one place, not just one city, but one home, right? One very small group of people. So the world narrowed really significantly as we sheltered in place, as we went through the lockdowns. And I realized going through that first COVID winter, where we didn't have the scaffolding of community, we didn't have our arts ecosystem. We weren't able to get through on dance and theater and music and inviting 30 people to come and eat dinner at the house, that it was a very, very difficult place for me to be without those support systems. I'd realized, I'd known for a very long time that Seattle wasn't necessarily the city that resonated most with my spirit or with my culture. But, it could make it work, and there are people coming there from all over the world. And so we built international communities. But without them, I really couldn't bear it. I thought, by the time, February, March 2021 rolled around, I thought, I cannot do that again. We're not going to go through this a second time. So I did another test run of being nomadic. I went to Mexico for 3 months at the end of 2021. First visit to Mexico, spent time across 3 cities, Mexico City, Oaxaca, Merida. Had an extraordinary time. Came back to Seattle. Left again for a month to Brazil and Argentina, where we saw each other again, actually. Had a wonderful time. Returned to Seattle. And then did another month in Ghana and Portugal. And when I returned that third time, I thought, why am I doing this? Why do I keep coming back when I could just keep going? And all of the other pieces are in place. I have the remote work. I've got the community across 6 continents. We even used to have Antarctica representation, though she's left since that time. I've got the support from family and friends because people are also travelers. They understand the importance of that. So there's nobody saying you need to stay in one place. There's nobody applying social pressure to stay in one place. So I thought, like, what is the obstacle? There's no real reason not to. So I spent that summer returning from Portugal, getting rid of my material life. So giving away, my art, my library, my cooking supplies. That was hard. Letting go of my Instant Pot and my cast iron pans wasn't easy. I remember having a little porch giveaway where I brought out my wardrobe and, my art objects, all of these things, just set them on the porch. and then had neighbors and friends coming throughout the weekend to take pieces and take them back to their homes. And it was a really beautiful way to kind of end that Seattle chapter, knowing that all of these material memories were going to have a new life and home with the people that I loved in Seattle. And that now when I come back and visit, I can see, on somebody's mantelpiece is a statue that came from my house. And hanging on somebody's wall is a tapestry that I gave them. And on somebody's bookshelf is a collection of books from my house. And they're cooking in the cast iron pan that I left for them. So it felt a lot easier to kind of let go of the material substance. And once it was all gone and I was down to one suitcase and one backpack for me, and then oppressing my family, one suitcase at my brother's house, one suitcase at my parents' house, then we were ready to roll. So I left September 29th, 2022, and have been in the global streets ever since.
Wow. What a journey.
Truly.
So when you're looking back at this journey, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, what have been some of the hardest moments for you as you transitioned?
In the transition to full-time travel,
Yes.
that's a challenging question to answer because, again, I think the circumstances of my life before this have made it a lot easier to make the transition. Because I've had, there's so many places around the world that I can describe as home, and so many people who are ready to welcome me into those home spaces. So some of the things that I think are typically concerns for people setting out: loneliness, social isolation, feeling like you're unsure how to navigate a new environment. Those are things that I have very rarely had to tackle because of this kind of welcoming safety net that exists globally. But I think one hard thing was contending with my own desire to be everywhere and do everything at once. So of course, suddenly when you've got the freedom to pick up and, tomorrow, if I wanted to, I could be in Jakarta, or tomorrow I could be in Dubai. You then have to start making some hard choices about prioritization. And, people will hear about this and they'll ask you, oh my gosh, okay, do you want to come on this trip? Oh, we've got this thing happening. Like, oh my gosh, yes, my wedding is happening here. Oh, my birthday's happening here. And it feels almost like, because you've got the freedom, there's also an obligation to be present. Like, what excuse do I have not to be there? And so I think in the first year, I spent a lot of time doing that, running around in order to try to be in as many places as possible. So I could spend, like 3 days in one city and then rush over here to make sure I got there in time for this event, and then like dash across and then not sleep on the red eye and then wake up and go straight to this other thing and then make sure that I could show up. And that's exhausting. I think coming to terms with the limits of your body in this situation can be hard. And I am a night owl. I've spent years and years and years in a state of advanced sleep deficit, sort of ignoring some of these things. But at this big age, those things don't hit the same way. You really feel the effects. You can start to feel the exhaustion, and then kind of deplete your energy and capacity to be present and to show up, or to get sick more easily because you're tired. So I have had to really start disciplining myself in terms of moderating expectations, calming down, saying that you will not be able to do everything. So, make judicious choices about where you can be present, figure out ways to continue to show up virtually when you can't be there physically, and build in time to rest during the transition periods. Because I think if you don't build the time to rest, your body will demand it from you and you won't have the choice about when that happens, which I've also experienced.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that in terms of wanting to see so much, and there is that desire to say yes to so many things and to so many plans and to so many people, but ultimately it can take a toll on you. And it's a common pattern that people who adopt this lifestyle tend to start moving really fast and
Hmm.
eventually slowly start moving a bit slower. I know we had a conversation a few years ago about my intention to spend 1 month per city.
Hmm.
But ultimately, when I looked back, even though I had that intention, it was so much faster. I think I
Yeah,
was moving at least every week, if not more often, from one city to the other, even though one might be in country for a
right.
month or two, there is always that desire to go and see different parts of the country and say yes to different opportunities to meet other people in other parts of the country, etc. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Absolutely.
So one thing that you talked about earlier was how you had the remote job.
Hmm.
So definitely makes it easier to be able
For
to
sure.
afford having this kind of lifestyle. In terms of helping maybe demystify the whole budgeting for travel
Hmm.
versus living a sedentary life, how do you think about your financial goals, and then how do you manage to afford the lifestyle and balance your budget with the travel, and how does it compare to your goals and how you were managing your finances and your budget when you were living in Seattle?
Absolutely. So I think, as you say, having a remote job is an enormous privilege and one of the main things that makes this possible. To be able to carry the office in your backpack, to have clients or employers who are supportive of that and who are willing to, make schedule adjustments where required has been huge. I mean, for example, being able to work from Australia at the beginning of this year. And admittedly, it wasn't easy. I was waking up at 6 to be on calls and had set expectations with the team who were still operating the day before that I would only be available from like noon to 5 Pacific time because I was going to be 6 or 7 a.m. to 11 or noon in Australia the next day. There's definitely been some adjustment required, but I've had an extraordinary fortune, again, of getting to work with clients, with employers who have understood and supported that even before it became global standard practice, when we all abruptly had to shift into remote work and hybrid models in 2020, 2021. And part of how it came about is that I was working, as mentioned, full-time role in Seattle for several years. And then I left that role in order to travel for nearly 6 months. And when I came back, I began doing the same work that I've been doing full-time, but did so in a consulting capacity. And the luck that I had to be able to launch that successfully is that two of my former employers were willing to hire me in a contract capacity. So I was able to take on projects for them as a contractor, able to work remotely and kind of start building that foundation. And then to use that as a launch pad to actively seek out clients through more traditional bidding processes, working online. I'd use the Upwork platform for freelance work in order to bid for and successfully win a few projects. And then those in turn spun out into longer lasting client relationships. So the work that I do now is with a client that I've actually had for 4 years, which started through a bidding process in 2021. So very much, there's a huge element of luck that I think went into it. Again, to have supportive colleagues, supportive employers at the beginning, and then being able to use those relationships to help build a reputation and a foundation that allowed me to seek out other opportunities and kind of continue rolling. In terms of how I think about budget is very funny. People are often asking me, my gosh, and how do you afford being on the road full time? And isn't it so expensive? And then I remind them that I used to live in Seattle, which is one of the most expensive cities in North America and one of the most expensive cities globally speaking when you think about cost of living. So as strange as it is, it's actually less expensive for me to be on the road than it is for me to maintain a home and a daily life in Seattle. And that's how I organized my budget. So when I looked at what my housing costs in Seattle had been, I said, all right, as I travel, I want the cost of my housing to be equal to or less than what I was paying monthly in Seattle. and see how we can make that happen. And my stretch goal was for the housing cost, not including plane tickets, because that is a new expense added on. But the housing cost should be half of what I used to pay in Seattle. That was my stretch goal. And I think last year I was able to meet that actually. Let me think back. Yeah. I think I ended up paying for housing slightly less than half of what I would have paid if I had been in one place, which is wild. And a huge part of that is where you choose to be. So certain cities, of course, are going to cost much less than others. I couldn't have done it if I was living in Copenhagen for a year, but being able to circulate, spending time partly in Europe, partly in the States, partly in Asia, partly in Africa, means that the cost of living definitely adjusts quite significantly. And then one other major thing that I know that you and I have talked about was adding house sitting into the rotation of housing options. So I used the Trusted House Sitters platform. And again, it was something that built over time through, developing a reputation, receiving really positive reviews and feedback from hosts. But it means that now I have been able to often offset up to maybe a third of the year's housing cost through house sitting. Where I am right now is a house sit I'm staying for a month and caring for a couple of little cats in New Orleans, which is wonderful. I will do the same in Seattle when I head there. I'll do the same in San Francisco when I head there. So that has been a really wonderful additional way to make the process of long-term travel and long stays in cities more sustainable.
Very well put. You mentioned the point around like the remote job being like an essential part of the equation to be able to adopt the digital nomad lifestyle. And I'm 100% with you on that. I find personally that a lot of people just think about working remotely as taking a job they're currently doing or a similar
Mhm.
job and trying to find another one like that. And I find that the most successful people who are able to work remotely and have the flexibility and the ability to make this lifestyle last is when they take a step back and say, all right, well, I'm not just going to fit into a box of a
Mhm.
job for a certain company, but really be able to assess one's skills and be able to
Mhm.
provide value to a certain market, to a certain employer, to a certain company you may able to
Mhm.
contract with. And I find that being able to work in freelance or starting your own company and be able to offer services or product or like I find that's the best approach because
Right.
ultimately certain employers are open to remote work, but depending on which
Not
direction
all of
the
them.
wind is going, they may, switch back. And we've seen that
Mhm.
trend over the last 2, 3 years where
Absolutely.
some companies and employers were very open to remote work, but they've kind of tied that. And then the other part of it is a lot of companies look at remote worker with a potential risk from a taxation perspective, from
Mhm.
a legal, and so they may
Yes,
set restrictions around where you can go, how long you can work overseas, etc.
totally.
And so being able to say, all right, well, what is it that I can create or build, or what is it that I can offer, and then being able to market your skills and create something new to be able to generate some income or some revenue for your company. I find is the best approach, which also means it may not be for everybody because maybe what it takes is gaining some experience, building some relationships, building reputation so that people will seek you out. And then you're in a position to be able to say, well, yes, I would love to work with you, but I'm not open to being a full-time employee. But if you're open to it, I'm happy to work with you as a vendor or as a contractor, where now the employer can no longer dictate where you should work from,
Mhm.
how you should work, but rather focus on the deliverables and the goals set for you. And I find that's typically the best direction to go when people are thinking about that piece of the equation.
Very much so. When I've thought several times about the calculus of returning to a full-time role, especially again, because there was such a paradigm shift in 2020. Suddenly employers that had never offered remote working options were forced to. There was no longer a choice. And companies discovered that, actually, there are some ways in which this is advantageous. There are some ways in which this is serving our employees' ability to live full lives. When you have competing caregiving concerns, for example, many parents really benefited so much from having a remote model, being able to build a schedule that worked around their children and being able to be more present with them as well. All of those things are very true. But as you say, the move back to hybrid models or sort of return fully to work is now in full swing. And that is, it's a freedom that is hard to relinquish. I definitely see the advantages of being part of a team in the long term, of getting to follow projects to their conclusion over years. I think one of the hard things about working freelance is that, you may be engaged very deeply for, let's say, a 3-month period. And then you're returning your work, you're releasing it, and you don't necessarily get to know what happens next. You're not within that company to understand how your project progresses, what it becomes, getting to see the fruitful outcomes a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. And you don't necessarily have the same long-term camaraderie either. So you're not working with the same people continuously over the course of the year, building that really strong professional relationship. And that can be challenging because I think it's an important thing that makes work easier. But then I balance that against the loss of freedom. As you say, the idea that because of tax considerations, an employer might not be comfortable with you staying in a place for more than a month at a time, or that you must be constrained to certain time zones, or tethered to an office within a single city. It's very hard to imagine returning to that life. I mean, I still think about it sometimes, but there's definitely a calculation to make.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I've pondered that myself and what it would feel like to be back.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it would be I think two parts. I think number one is the aspect of working for an employer versus being self-employed or being the founder of your own company or startup versus actually taking on a job. And then the other part is the whole schedule piece
Yeah.
where we have the privilege and freedom to work whenever we want, where, yeah, we may work on Saturday or Friday or Wednesday, they're just not a day, and being able to do activities during the week when certain destination may not be as busy, or having the luxury to not have to commute and being able
Mm-hmm.
to, even if you want to do something, you can just do it in the middle of the day and maybe work later in the day. So all of that just makes it very challenging to try to, fit it into a more traditional lifestyle. But who knows? Like,
We'll see.
life take us in interesting directions.
It might. It's very true.
Let me ask you a different question, Rachel. So you've got your job piece of the equation set. Now, let's talk about how you figure out where to go and what's important to you.
Mm.
We've talked about the rhythm of
Mhm.
travel, which has shifted for you over the years. And so now, how do you decide where to go, how long to stay for? How do you decide your priorities and how long you stay in a certain place versus, maybe going somewhere else? And so, how do you think about your planning for travel? And more importantly, as somebody who may want to adopt this, and
Mhm.
what advice do you have for them and how should they think about it? What factors should they consider as they think about the itinerary and their plans going into a full-time travel lifestyle?
Mhm. So I often start my planning process, for an upcoming year by thinking about community first. A lot of the way that I've always anchored my travel is around, major milestone events, big things happening. So I'll know, for example, this coming year, I have a cousin who's getting married in England in August. So I use that as a starting point to say, okay, I know I've got to be in London on this date. And so let me now build around that and see what opportunities there are. I'll often, now that I'm using the house sitting website, sometimes use those opportunities to help shape the stay. So I might look and say, oh, there's somebody who's actually looking for a house sitter for the month of August in London. Fantastic. I'll apply for this opportunity. If I get it, that means I'll be in this city for a month. The event that I'm meant to be at will be within that time. And then I will have the chance to explore at a leisurely pace outside of that. So I use those anchor points throughout the year. I think it's also important, as because for me, I want to make sure that I'm spending time intentionally with my loved ones. So I know there's got to be at least one time per year when I am with my family, and maybe we're traveling together, or I've gone to see them at home. I want to, see the dear friends. Maybe folks have welcomed new babies this year, and I want to make sure I have the chance to see them and to meet the new little ones. All right, we set those dates in place, and then start looking at the opportunities surrounding them. I think a definitely significant consideration that follows on the job conversation is that the conditions for work have got to be good. And I've definitely had the experience early on of grappling with poor Wi-Fi, staying in places that don't necessarily have dedicated workspace. So, maybe you're sitting in bed on a laptop because you don't have a desk to work from. And that I think can be really challenging. So as I've taken, more time and as I've slowed it down from city to city, the work infrastructure has also become a much bigger consideration. So now when I'm going to a place, I'm going to be checking, how is the Wi-Fi situation? Do we have stable electricity? Is the place that I'm staying able to accommodate an actual regular workspace? Are there co-working spaces? Is there a culture of remote work that exists in this place that offers you some additional scaffolding if for some reason the situation where you're staying isn't ideal for your work? Is it a place where there's a late cafe culture? Are you able to take your laptop and maybe go to a cafe in the afternoon or evening to perch and get some work done when you're in a time zone that's far away from your clients? For example, I'm working often with people on the Pacific coast of the US, and I might be, in Europe or in West Africa at the time. So I'm, 8, 9 hours ahead of where they are. So I've got to be able to work in the evening in the place where I am and need to make sure that there are facilities and conditions that support that. So that is a huge factor. And it's definitely one of the biggest pieces of advice I have for folks who are trying to work and travel is, to not be afraid to really prioritize those requirements, because there's nothing worse than scrambling to try and find a decent internet connection when you've got a major call coming up, you've got to present something, your connection's cutting out, like things are not working, you've had a sudden power outage. It's just a level of stress that is not necessary. There's no need. And I think that also, and this is something I'm still working on, I haven't quite figured out that art yet, but it also makes you build in true vacation time. Because I think that, as again, folks who work remotely, and as you said, when you've got the flexibility to work all the time or at any time, sometimes you do. It's very difficult to actually shut that off and take a step away from the computer and just be present in the place where you are. So I think that, if you're able to kind of make the choices about where you want to be, when you're working, having a logistical setup that makes sense, then it also allows you to switch off and say, okay, so for the places I want to go where the conditions are not great, I'm going to do that as a holiday. I'm going to do that as a vacation. When I think about that in my case, for example, that is much of Southeast Asia. I've never had the chance to travel to Thailand, to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to Laos, Cambodia. And part of that is because of the work schedule, because I'd be 12 hours ahead and I'd essentially be working the night shift, which is not a reasonable thing for me to do. As much as I like to think that I would be able to work from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., I know that that's not actually realistic. So instead, now I'm able to think about that and plan for that as true rest time, true holiday time. To say, I will plan in the next year to take this chunk of time off of work and to go and explore this place and fully be present in, sort of the experience of it.
Great, thanks for sharing. When you think about the work piece, you talked about taking some time off to have some vacation time. What actually ends up being your typical day? And is it that, you're just living somewhere else and, you're working all the time, and then when you take time off, it's to go actually explore? How do you think about being in a new place and having the desire to go explore and discover the place and go sightseeing? Because for people, who may not be familiar with this kind of lifestyle, when they think about travel, it's about holiday and vacation. So
Right.
help us understand how you think about your lifestyle, where, on any given week or any given month, you may be in a different locality, in a new city, in a new country. So how do you think about your schedule? Let's say you spend a month in a new place, in a new country, in a new city. How do you manage your time? How would you live your life in that new place versus if you were living full-time in Seattle?
So I think this is going to vary significantly depending on the time zone and the time zone difference. And one thing I found is that for me, for example, I think almost the ideal scenario is to be working with Pacific clients and for me to be based in the GMT adjacent time zones. So looking at Western Europe, West Africa, because being 8 hours ahead, it means that I can work, let's say, a 2 p.m. to 9 p.m. schedule. And that allows me to wake up. So I have my morning. I'm able to do a lot of morning exploration. You know this about me already. I'm centered deeply on food and cultural space. When I go to a new city, I want to eat my way through a city's diversity, through its history. I want to explore and understand, spending time in museums and cultural institutions and getting to meet people and be in conversation with them. And so, I can take my morning to do that between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. Maybe I've gone off, I've had a leisurely breakfast, I've met somebody for coffee, I've gone to see this new museum exhibit that's open. It's quiet because it's 11 a.m. on a Wednesday and nobody's there. I get to have my nice lunch and then I'm able to return and get started. I'm also ahead still of that Pacific day. So I get to feel like I'm jump starting my work day when people are waking up on that side. I've already been able to get some things done. I've been able to send them material that they need, that they're then able to work on and return to me. So it gives me a feeling of being productive early in a day. And then you've got that afternoon, so maybe 2 to 9, taking calls, writing documents, meeting with people. And then by 9 p.m., you're still in a place that has a nocturnal life. So, for example, you're in Milan. It's very normal for Italians to go out for dinner at 9:30 or 10 p.m. So you're not out of step with the rhythm of that place while living this life. And that I really enjoy. I think it can feel a bit alienating if, as mentioned, like the Southeast Asia challenge, if you are working at times when everybody else is socializing, and then when you're ready to socialize, everybody else is at work or asleep. That is really challenging to feel like you can't integrate with the social rhythm of a place. So it's wonderful to be able to say, all right, that I'm done clocking off at 9, I'm going to rejoin the rhythm of life here. Buenos Aires is another great example. Finish your working day, people are still eating dinner, 11 p.m., midnight. You can just go join them, have a wonderful time, get a reasonable night of sleep. And then when you wake up in the morning, you've still got hours before anybody's looking for you in your work. And I think that that is really the ideal scenario. So I do try to structure my days that way. Sometimes it looks different. In Australia, I had to become an early bird. So instead, I was working from, let's say, 6 a.m. to 1 p.m. I start really early, but after 1, I had the rest of my day. So again, able to go out, able to meet people, able to explore. It's still daytime, so if you want to get into like nature activities, you can do that. You want to have a fabulous, luxurious late lunch, you can do that. And then still, get into bed at a reasonable hour, feel well rested to be able to tackle your day. So that's generally how I try to organize myself. I want to fit in as much as possible to the social existence of the place so that I'm able to connect and meet people and build community, and then give myself a reasonable window of work and focus as well.
Great. Thanks for the insights. So, Rachel, I want to ask you a few questions about different aspects of lifestyle and maybe hear a little bit about your story and your advice again. And so let's go through a few of them. The first one I'd like to ask you about is packing.
Okay.
So, what have been the challenges for you when it comes to that? No, living out of suitcase. What do you take with you? What do you not take with you? What are some of the hacks and common practices that you've learned over time? I know you have a great sense of fashion and you really care about that aspect. And it can be a little challenging with this kind of lifestyle and having to go from one place to the other.
Oh my gosh, I knew you were going to get me with this question. Yes, so that has been definitely a challenge because, as you mentioned, I love fashion, I love textile, and one of the things that I enjoy as a memory from the places that I visit is actually to bring something home from that place. So to be able to, buy something from a local designer in Brazil or to have a piece made in Ghana is a really beautiful way, I think, to hold the memory of that place as you continue traveling. But once you spend about 2.5 years living out of a suitcase, that suitcase starts to get a little full. And I aspire to be one of these people who is fully carry on, maybe like a single bag or 145 liter, 128 liter. At the moment, that's not me. I have a 55 liter checked bag, medium size, and then a backpack and a little tote to handle the overflow. And I was resistant to it at first because I don't love checking luggage. But I realized, at a certain point, you just need to know what makes it joyful for you to travel and easy. So rather than feeling stress every time you're repacking your bag, being worried it's near the weight limit, you can't zip it closed, like, oh my gosh, the capacity is just too much, and now they're going to make me gate check it, and it's going to get lost. I prefer to have the wiggle room to say, all right, now my luggage is not overweight. If I want to buy a gift for somebody as I go, there's an extraordinary book that I'd like to pick up. There's room for me to hold that. And so I'm not going to place unnecessary additional pressure on myself for something that like doesn't contribute to my well-being. I do think it's extremely important for me, at least, to have reliable laundry in the places where I go. That's another thing that I've come to understand over the last couple of years. I need to be able to easily wash my clothes. And of course, that allows you to be lighter in your packing because you can rotate your wardrobe more frequently. So that is really huge. In terms of essentials, I mean, not having to iron is very exciting. So, like, thinking very carefully about the pieces that you bring. Are they easily maintained? Can you machine wash them? Do you not have to iron them? Do they go easily with everything that you already have? Can you mix and match your clothing well so that you have the sense of variety and change? You don't feel as if your wardrobe is monotonous, but again, you're not having to carry around ludicrous numbers of things. And then also always remembering that like we can get by with less than we think. There are times now when I return to places and I'll see, a friend of mine in the like peep in their closet and they've got, 20 handbags. And I just think, there's literally no reason that we need this. Like I have had one handbag for the last 2.5 years. I carry multiple pairs of shoes for different purposes, but practically there's basically one that I wear 90% of the time, and it's totally fine. Like nobody ever comments, nobody's, critiquing that or wondering why I'm the only one who would be anxious about it for any reason. So that's a really important reminder. Just, moderate the things you carry, have enough of them to bring you joy, but know that you'll be perfectly fine without most of the things that we tend to hold on to when we have a home space and when we have like the storage space to accumulate stuff.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the lifestyle teaches you to let go of
It
things
does.
and try to make the most of little, very little. So
It
definitely
does.
good exercise to go through, but it comes with as challenging as you were.
Mm.
Okay, so that's for packing. Let me ask you another area to think about is relationships. And so
Mm.
how do you think about relationships, about dating? I know we talked a little bit about friendships before and
Right.
how you think about your travel schedule and going places to be able to see friends or be
Mhm.
there for important life milestones. And so how do you think about dating? How do you think about meeting somebody or traveling with a partner and everything that's related to this topic with this life?
Yeah, do everything? Are you sure?
We have plenty of time, so
Ah, oh my goodness. So this has also been a really interesting area to explore. I think not least because the cultures of relationships and dating are very different globally, right? So the ways that people interact, the things that people expect in, at Dakar, for example, are not the same from what people are looking for in London or what they expect in Mexico City or what they expect in Beijing. So I think that, dating is kind of an extraordinary cultural adaptation exercise as you go to new places and you get to learn, how does this work here? What are the ways that you all approach this? What's most important and valuable to you? I think for me, I I think, released certain expectations about dating. I don't expect it to look one way or to take a single shape. And I'm not actively seeking a, sort of full-time partnership with, one person who's with you all the time, maybe traveling with you all the time. If that happens, which as we know very well it does, that would be exciting, but it's not an active goal that I set for this time. I leave that to circumstance. But I do use dating as a means of getting to know a place better culturally. And I think one thing I've discovered that I've been deeply grateful for is that even when you are in a place for a short amount of time, people can be extraordinarily generous with their knowledge, with their insights, with just sharing how it is that they experience this place, giving you access to spaces and experiences that you wouldn't have had if you were not with somebody local. And my friends laugh at me a lot when I tell them that I use dating apps for like informational interviewing about getting to know a place and people. But I mean, I will say that it has really worked. I have such fond memories of experiences like going to Guadalajara by myself during the Christmas season and meeting somebody on a dating app who said, "Oh, you've never been here. Okay, let me take you on a 5 hour tour of my favorite museums and spaces in the city. Let me take you to my favorite places to eat. Let's talk about what this city is like, about my experience coming of age here, what I love about it, why I would stay." I think of the person in New York who was willing to meet me for the first time at 1 in the morning. And we went to go and listen to Brazilian music and then took me to the secret window in the back of the dance club where there was Korean fried chicken being slung out of the back at 3 a.m. And we're having this fabulous meal, like speaking about life and culture. And then find this other little bar under a bridge where they're playing like live West African percussion and bembe. And we're out dancing until 5, and that people will do that without expectation, right? They do that to say like this experience in itself is valuable. I'm grateful for this specific time shared. It doesn't mean that I anticipate that it will happen again, that it will happen in the same way. If it does, that would be so wonderful. But I'm grateful for and I value this shared experience as a single entity. I think that is probably the kind of interaction that has most shaped, my city exploration and dating experiences. Because again, through that, I've gotten to know places at a level that would have been completely impossible if I'd just been trying to explore on my own. I'd have had no context, no idea of where to start. And so people will open doors for me to much richer and so fuller experiences of place. And I've been again deeply, deeply grateful for that because I know that the situation is unusual, right? To be a nomad, swinging into town for a couple of weeks, meeting folks, saying, hi, hello, what a lovely afternoon, nice to meet you. All right, I'm off, and I may never see you again. But thanks, that was great. Not everybody would be comfortable with that. Not everybody can adjust to that. But I've been happily surprised by how many people are willing to engage. The other thing that it's made me realize is that the world can be so small because of the ways that an increased number of people are moving through it with more fluidity. I've had the experience of matching on an app with somebody in Brussels and meeting them for the first time in Dakar, or matching with somebody in London and our first date was in Nairobi, or matching, oh my goodness, this actually just happened, matching with somebody in Salvador, in Brazil. And then, having had a really lovely time and left Brazil and not thinking anymore about it. And then I get to Copenhagen and I get a message on a dating app that says, what are you doing here? And I look and it's the same person from Salvador who now happens to be in Denmark. Oh my gosh. So that has also been deeply precious, is getting the chance to meet people in multiple contexts as well, to have, that sense that the world is small and will welcome you in unanticipated ways. I think that I've been additionally very, very grateful for.
Great, thanks for sharing. The other topic I'd love to hear your perspective on is staying healthy and managing being far away from loved ones and potentially getting sick at times.
Mm-hmm.
About that, as it's a common fear that many people have.
I mean, it is, I think, a reasonable concern for sure, and it does happen. I've definitely had a few episodes over the last couple of years of, getting awfully ill. Usually it's a stomach bug. You get too enthusiastic about some street food and then face some unanticipated consequence. I think that in terms of staying in touch with loved ones, it's again a practice that we have had to build as a family for a very long time and as friend groups for a very long time because we've historically lived very far away from each other. So there is kind of a common practice of you're just checking in every few days as the standard of communication and care. And that is a way to let your loved ones know how you are, make sure that they kind of understand the rhythms of your day-to-day life. They have a sense of where you're staying. If there are any people who could be contacts or friends of friends who are near where you are. So you've got like a little local support network to reach out to if you need it. And then that also makes sure that they are kind of monitoring for your presence. So if, for example, then you're not checking in suddenly, people see that as unusual and that they will take the time to then look for you, make sure that you're all right, give you a call, which you might need, and might not have been able to express yourself. I find that very important. And when I think about broadly my physical safety as well, that is something that I do as a practice. So I will let my family, my parents and brothers know roughly where I'm planning to be and give them the contact number of the host that I'm staying with, so that should there ever be a time when they can't reach me, there's somebody there that they would be able to get in touch with who would be able to check in and figure out what's going on. As far as physical health, I do always carry the little kit of essentials. You've got your pain relief, you've got your stomach meds, you've got your activated charcoal, things that I swear by for managing times of illness. I like to make sure that I've got like foundational pharmacy kit on hand so that I'm able to manage like mild concerns. And then, I certainly also, as well, I will map out in a new neighborhood or a place, where's your nearest clinic? Where's your nearest hospital? What is your emergency number in this place? How do you get there if you need that help? And just know that information as a matter of course, so that you do not have to try and scramble to find it when you're in an acute situation.
Those are important concerns. You start talking about safety. So how do you think about going to new places, and how do you make sure, you mentioned sharing with your loved ones about where you're staying and having contact information. What are your general consideration from a safety perspective in terms of choosing a place to go to, maybe picking the accommodations you're gonna stay in terms of choosing what kind of activities, or whether you'll be out and about at night? How do you really think about the whole factor of safety depending on where you are in the world?
For sure. And I think that point, depending on where you are in the world, is huge because safety considerations differ wildly from place to place, and they differ wildly from person to person. And I know you and I have talked about this, but for example, what you consider safe and comfortable to do, especially as a man, may be very different from what I'm able to do comfortably as a woman or as a Black woman in certain spaces. So when I'm assessing, I'll actually first start from that point. I think there's a lot of advice on the internet about travel that's written by a very small demographic of people. When you think about who has got the access, the resources, the time to be able to travel, very often you're talking about, folks from perhaps the US or the UK or Canada, folks who may be a bit older, maybe they are in their 40s and 50s, they've got, some of like the leisure time, they've got the capital to be able to travel, they've got that freedom. Many of them, for that reason, may also be white. Very, very similar thing that has a different level of economic privilege in the places where you are. And the things that are important for their safety and comfort may be very different from the things that are important for my safety and comfort, given the differences between us. So when I'm going to a place, I'm looking for somebody who is as close to my profile as possible, and I'm asking them what their safety practices are. So, for example, when I go to Brazil, there's a lot of conversation about the danger in Brazil's major cities, these places that you must avoid at all costs, and you risk being robbed if you're here or here. I would rather speak to a Brazilian woman in her 30s and understand from her, how do you move about this city safely? Where are the places that you feel comfortable? What are the precautions that you take at night when you're traveling? And based on what that person says, I will then adapt my behavior to match their experience, because we have a similar profile, we'll be perceived the same way. Even if I am not a Brazilian, people might not actually be able to tell that just by looking at me while I'm walking around. So for me to take on the safety practices of a Brazilian woman actually helps me to blend in more easily, helps me to be perhaps perceived as local, and might then help me to avoid certain challenging situations that could come up as a tourist. So that's always my go-to first practice. Get the safety information from somebody who reflects your experience as closely as possible. And then when I'm thinking about, for example, where to stay, I have definitely been an Airbnb user, but I like to think about it as a homestay. So if I'm traveling by myself to a new place, I will choose to stay with a family, or I will choose to stay with a host. I want a room within a home so that there's somebody who, again, similarly to what we talked about, is aware of my comings and goings. They know that I'm here, they know that I'm in and out exploring. They would ask questions, they would be concerned if I didn't show up one fine day when I was expected. They would, ask after me. They would be willing to share their own tips about their neighborhood and how to navigate it. And I think that has been a really wonderful experience, not just from a safety perspective, but again, getting to embed more fully into a community. There's nothing like staying with, again, the people who've lived in this neighborhood, who know it well, who can advise you on how to make the most. And some of my best travel experiences have come from, listening to and following those recommendations, or even just being welcomed in the home and having the chance to sort of sit and be in conversation with the folks who are hosting me. If I think again about that Guadalajara trip, my Airbnb hosts were really lovely and kind, and they invited me to join them for their Christmas Eve dinner. And the friends who came to join them had been Airbnb guests of theirs previously, who had loved Guadalajara so much that they moved to the city, and now they were all friends. So you could see that there was this investment in, community and relationship and hospitality, making people feel welcome. So that's an experience I'll absolutely seek out when I know that I'm traveling solo to a new city. I'll certainly share information about where I am and who I'm with. Every time I go to a new country, I'm sending my family group chat the basic information. Here's the address where I'm staying. This is the number of the person who's hosting me. This is the contact information of maybe a person that I know or I'm connected to in this city. If ever you can't find me, look for these folks. If I'm in an Uber late at night for the first time, coming back from the airport, I don't know the city yet, I'm sending that share location link to family or to friends who are nearby to say, hey, just so you're aware, this is where I am right now. I'll check in and let you know when I'm at the house safely. But I just want somebody else to have an awareness of where I'm supposed to be so that they, will take notice if then, for some reason something changes or I'm not there.
Yeah. Now you raised some great points. Thank you for sharing. That's definitely an area where I get a lot of questions when
Right.
people start thinking about solo traveling, especially when we're talking about women in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe need to be a little more thoughtful about safety while traveling.
It makes a
So
really big difference.
you touched on a point that was interesting around the connecting with some of the locals and getting that local perspective. So I'd like to transition maybe to the next area I'd like to maybe
Mm-hmm.
dive into a little bit is around building relationships. So you mentioned a couple of mechanisms. One of them is
Yeah.
connecting through hosts. You may be visiting some friends. We talked about using dating apps. And so how do you think about um, building the connections, being able to connect with new people, build a certain social network in a certain place, and what advice do you give others? Because that's definitely another theme that comes in more very often is that fear of being alone and relationship and foster
Mm-hmm.
relationship with others in a new place where you may not have the cultural context, you may not have the relationship already built or that network built. And so let's say you're come to a new place and you don't know anybody and you're gonna be there for a while. What's your approach for building that network of people and fostering your friendships?
100%. I think one, again, luck factor in this is your baseline personality to begin with. Because, of course, we know that there are folks who are highly extroverted, who think nothing of meeting strangers, bringing groups together. And then there are those who are a bit more introverted, who might be a bit more cautious about meeting new people, might have a bit of hesitation about stepping out of that comfort zone. And I happen to be one of the extroverts. So I think that that already is a very lucky factor. I feel no qualms about meeting strangers, about connecting strangers even with one another, about hosting a gathering in a city I've never been to of people I've never met. That does not concern me at all. I find that very enjoyable. And actually, one of the ways that I derive just the most delight when traveling. But I know that that is not everybody's truth. And so there are definitely a few other mechanisms that I think can be a little bit easier to access. One of the big ones, and the way that we met, was through the couchsurfing community. I think that that is often a lovely place to start, especially if you're a little bit more nervous about meeting new folks, because I find that in a community like that, people are self-selecting for the traits that would make them welcoming and more open to meeting strangers. They are interested in travel, they are globally minded, generally quite culturally competent, maybe they speak more than one language, and they're interested in exchanges of stories, exchanges of information. So often one tactic I'll use is to get onto couchsurfing when I arrive in a new place and see, is there a community here? Are there events that maybe somebody's already planned? Are there a number of other travelers, possibly, who are also in this place at the same time and might want to join forces to do some exploring together? I will reach out to people individually, or I might maybe post an event myself, use the Hangouts feature to say, hey, I'm planning to go to this night market today. If there's anybody else who would be interested in that, send me a note and let's do it together. And that has been a really lovely way of connecting with, again, people who are hospitable, who are open-minded, and who may also be local and be able to connect you to their friends and their community who's in this space. So then you have that warm introduction to a much wider group of people that you might be able to begin building community with. That's worked out very beautifully. Then there's also, of course, the dating app method. So that I think it also serves that purpose of pre-selecting people who are open to meeting, right? If you know that you've matched with somebody on an app, the idea is that there's some degree of mutual interest and that the person would be open to connecting in person. It's not quite as intimidating as approaching somebody maybe just in the street to ask if they would like to spend some time together or hang out. You've both set a little bit the stage of saying, all right, like we're willing to at least give this a try over some coffee and see if there's any resonance there. I found that to be super helpful. And again, I think I've been happily surprised by how generous people are willing to be, even if you know you're not going to be there for that long, and even if you're not interested in romantic connections at that time. Many people will still, they have like a curiosity, right? Again, about the world, about travelers. They might want to know, similarly to this conversation, how did you get into this lifestyle? I get tons of questions about, oh my gosh, how did you become a nomad? Wow, that's a dream of mine. I've always wanted to go to place A or place B. How did you get there? Oh, I'm actually taking my first trip. Can you share recommendations? We'll meet, we'll exchange stories, we'll talk about things like that. Sometimes I'll be able to help facilitate their access in some way so that they get the chance to start adventuring or exploring in a similar fashion. The host piece, of course, is huge. So again, if you get the chance to stay with an individual host, stay with a family, get their insight and advice, maybe connect with their broader community, that's a lovely way to get plugged into a city. And then I think also looking for hobby or affinity groups. So if there's something that you really enjoy doing, maybe in your everyday life, you are a hiker, you love bouldering, you're a pole dancer, you love to sing, you can look for the groups in that city that are doing something similar. I was just on a trip in Puerto Rico with some dear friends, and one of them has had a pole studio practice for many years. And so she found a studio in Puerto Rico and went to a class while we were there and met some really wonderful people. They already had that shared foundation of an activity that they love and that they're learning and getting better at. And that was a gateway for her to make new community connections and maybe to think about returning in the future to extend her practice or maybe do a retreat or an intensive. I think that can also be a really wonderful low barrier entry point. If you are a musician, that is one of the greatest joys because music translates universally. So if you go to a class or you go to a jam, you go and meet other musicians, you're able to connect right away over that shared skill and even to build something together, regardless of whether you speak the same language. And I think that's a wonderful entry point for community connection.
Oh, great. Those were some really good ideas that I'm sure a lot of people will find useful. Yeah, definitely getting out there and just connecting, goes a long way. Just being able to get out of the little, bubble or the little, safety in your Airbnb and just being able to say, yeah, let's just go out there and do some activity, participate in an event, go to a meetup. Yeah, and that's how it starts. And slowly but surely you can start building some connections.
Absolutely. I also forgot to mention actually language exchanges are a wonderful place to start getting connected. Because, of course, again, you're self selecting for people who are interested in other cultures, who are actively learning and so seeking the opportunity to learn from you, to see what you might be able to exchange with each other. I had the experience recently of going to a language exchange in southern Spain and meeting a woman there from Finland who was also there learning Spanish. And it turned out that we were both going to be in Melbourne, Australia in a couple of months' time. So we met again in Australia 2 months later and got to explore a new country together. And, like who would have imagined that that kind of connection would grow out of randomly running into somebody at, a tapas bar in Sevilla? But it's definitely the sort of place that is likely to attract people who maybe even share some aspect of that lifestyle as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one thing that you just mentioned around like reconnecting with people, it also sometimes takes maintaining those relationships. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
easy as you travel to go from one place to the other and move on. But if you find and you connect with some interesting people, it's worth staying in touch and checking in with
Mm-hmm.
people and continue building the relationship and asking about where they plan to travel next if they're travelers or potentially looking for opportunities to have some shared experiences, reconnect elsewhere. Just like anything, you have to water the plant and
You
and
do,
build that relationship over time, which may
sure,
be more challenging if you're not physically in the same place all the time, but it's absolutely doable as well.
for sure.
Okay, so let me maybe go back to a point that you mentioned earlier and maybe dive in a little more in that topic, which was the topic of being a minority
Mm-hmm.
today, or we've talked a lot about your experiences in the past around being a Black woman and going to a place where maybe you look different from all the locals, but also different from other potential visitors that
Mm-hmm.
region or that city or that place can be. So how do you think about diversity and your experience and making the most for somebody else who may look like you, and how do you navigate all of that?
So it's a huge, huge topic and a topic that has a lot of nuance depending on the place that you're from and depending on the place that you plan to visit, especially when you think about how your identities are perceived differently in different cultures and contexts. Because even what it means to be Black is not the same between the United States, Brazil, South Africa, the UK, Morocco. Like all of these places have different implications for the same identity. Like the way that you're seeing me right now, okay, like a Black woman and wearing a head wrap and then the colors and the jewelry, people will tell very different stories about this depending on where I am. So I think again that is an extremely important foundation to begin with. That before you go to a place, again, looking for folks who share some aspects of your lived experience and asking them about how they have navigated that place. When I'm preparing to go somewhere that I don't know, and maybe there's a reputation even that there might be some concern for me because of some aspect of who I am. I will seek out travel affinity groups and start asking people. So looking for women's travel groups and then saying, hey, who here has been to this place? What can you tell me about your time there? Or looking for Black women's travel groups doing something that's very similar. All right, like what has been your experience? How were you perceived? Did you feel comfortable navigating? What were the things that made it easier or harder? And I'll take in that information to help me make some decisions about where I would like to travel, how I would like to navigate that place. And when I'm there, I'm also very much looking for opportunities to tap into community and opportunities to be supportive of community. So, for example, if I think about being here in New Orleans or being in Brazil or being in the UK, I'm often looking for spaces that are owned, operated by, in community with Black people, with people of the African diaspora, with Black women, because it's important to me to use my resources as a visitor to infuse, capital and resources into that community to the extent possible. So that would be a foundation for my research. I'm spending time on Instagram, I'm spending time on Reddit, I'm spending time on Google, looking for what those spaces are, where do people gather and how, how can I plug into that respectfully as somebody who is coming from outside? And often, that interaction will again open up an entirely new set of doors. If I go to the Black-owned bookstore in a city and I look at their community board, suddenly there are 15 different things here that I wasn't aware of. There's this event happening. There's this new store that's opened. There's this restaurant you should try. There's these people that you should meet. And it just exponentially expands my perception of the city, my avenues for exploration. I think because of the amount of time that I've spent in Washington State and in Seattle, I'm very accustomed to being the only person like me in a space. That was true of when I lived in the city for a decade. I was an anomaly in that place. So every day somebody's asking me, oh my gosh, like, where are you from? What's going on with this? Like, something about this just doesn't make sense. Like, who are you? So I think that sensation doesn't inherently bother me. I've navigated it before, I'm comfortable doing it, but I do still find it very important to seek out some of the affinity spaces. And again, to be thoughtful about how I can support them, because in many cases, they also need resources in order to continue functioning, in order to continue serving communities. So as much as we can support that, I think that it's a good thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. How do you think about the impact of our lifestyles and us as visitor going to communities? You mentioned, like, finding your people in certain places, but it's also, there is a community that lives there with a certain culture, with a certain identity, where we're just passing by, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. So I know you think a lot about that. And so I guess, what are your thoughts on how we should think about ourselves in this community that we're visiting, and how do we make sure that the impact we have is positive in the long term by us being there?
I think it's a massively important question. I think if you look at, what the news has said over the last couple of years, if you look at sentiment and how it's changed in some of, let's say, the major digital nomad hotspot cities around the world, there's been a lot of backlash to this lifestyle. And I think that it's very reasonable, because if you have a group of people who are entering into a space with little regard for economic impact, little regard for cultural integration, and who essentially come and create a cultural and economic bubble there. So perhaps you come from the States, you do not make an effort to learn the language where you are staying at places that are owned by other Americans, you are eating at international chains. Like, the life that you're living is then not offering any material benefit to the community that's hosting you. All of the resources that you're putting in are just going straight back out, back to the US where they came from. And I think that is incredibly problematic, because by your presence, you're also making the economic life harder for folks who are living there already. We've all heard the story about the skyrocketing of housing prices in Mexico City or in Lisbon or in Chiang Mai, because thousands of people coming from a different level of economic power have come to that place, decided it's attractive, and then sort of taken over the space. And again, not done so with a conscientious structure about how to ensure that resources stay in community. So that is a huge part of what I think about when I'm going to a new place. For example, it gets right back to that question of, where do you stay? I always want to be sure that, if I'm coming by myself, I'm staying with a family, or, with someone in a way that actually allows them to be able to remain where they are. So, is the money that I'm paying going to make sure that, like, this person's better able to pay their mortgage or to sustain their housing costs in order to maintain their primary residence, rather than taking an apartment that perhaps could have been the primary home for somebody who lived in that city if it wasn't being used for short-term rental. I'm much more attuned towards right homestays, house sitting, the kinds of lodging that again support that person's day-to-day life in the place. It's another reason why I'm always looking to, as much as possible, spend my money with locally owned businesses. I want to eat at locally owned restaurants. I want to work at locally owned cafes. I want to, even if you're, like I said, was going to a gym, like I don't want to go to a chain. I want to go to a local dance studio or, work with like a local trainer. I want to make sure as much as possible that every dollar that I'm spending is staying in a community and circulating within a community. So I do my very, very best, to avoid sort of like internationally recognized brands or American brands. There's some places that make it easier than others. Some places have, I think, a much more thriving local business ecosystem than others do. A shout out to New Orleans for that, by the way. It's been like really extraordinary, especially from a local food perspective, how many family owned and run places are surviving and doing well here, which is amazing. But I think sometimes it takes extra work to find them. And it can be really easy to slip into the default position of like, the Starbucks is right there. Like, let me just go do that because it's simple and I recognize it and like I know what I'm gonna get. But I think that it behooves us to make the extra effort to do the research and find the places where the money that we spend will make more of an impact and will allow more of the people who actually live in this community to stay there and to enjoy it as much as possible.
Yeah. Great. On a related topic, I know that there is another topic that you think about a lot is for travelers with maybe accessibility limitation or mobility limitations. And so maybe how do you think about traveling and maybe even having this kind of lifestyle with somebody with those kind of challenges, and how would you advise them to navigate
Mm.
such a thing?
So that's been a very important topic for me and for my family for a very long time. I have an older sibling who has some quite severe physical and developmental disabilities, but who is also absolutely a traveler like the rest of us. And so when we plan, family gatherings, when we're going to new places together, there's absolutely an additional lens to think about accessibility. And that can look like mobility concerns. So how walkable, for example, is this place? Is there a pedestrian infrastructure that's relatively easy to navigate? It looks like thinking about the kinds of homes or lodgings that we stay in. What is bathroom access like? Are there lots of stairs to navigate? Are there ways that you can support yourself when you're walking up and down? Like, how much does this allow you to have independent mobility within this house? What is the local culture like when it comes to disability and access? Are public spaces accommodating? Are people accommodating in their attitudes? Are they likely to, be able to help to support you to find solutions? Maybe when the solutions are not built in to the infrastructure or to the ecosystem already. As always, I revert to my initial research tendencies before I go anywhere. And I think it's really important here to consult the voices of travelers who have that lived experience. So there's some really extraordinary travel bloggers who are navigating full-time travel as wheelchair users, for example, or navigating with quadriplegia, maybe navigating travel with a full-time caregiver as a companion who is helping them to navigate these new spaces. So hearing from folks who have had those experiences, who've worked with travel agencies, who've thought about accessibility, who are able to respond and say, okay, this destination does this, and this really well. I found it as a power chair user quite navigable. These are the places I stayed. Here were some of the hurdles that I ran into that I'll make you aware of so you don't go through the same thing. I always want to start listening to those voices. Then I will often go to a place before I encourage my family to travel there together because I actually literally want to walk the same streets, to be in these neighborhoods, to observe for myself. All right, how are these factors looking? Like, if I'm here with my brother, how will he be able to navigate this space? So I'll do a sort of initial walkthrough as an advanced scout. And then once I have the sense that, right, I think this could work, then we might plan a trip together. And, each time we discover something new, right? There's some factor that we hadn't calculated for, and we make some adjustments on the fly while we're there. But it's been a really fantastic learning experience for us. I think with each trip, we're getting a better sense of what it means to, again, kind of build accessibility tools and to improvise when you need to. And certain places make it easier because the community attitude is to find solutions. We will figure out a way and we'll do it without making you feel conspicuous or making you feel like you are a burden. I think one place that I have deeply appreciated for this is Mexico. It's a place where we've traveled as a family now 3 times. And in each of those times, we've had those interactions in community where people will see that there's a need. And just like without any kind of fuss or ceremony, find a solution and just make a quick suggestion. I think about the B&B that we stayed in Oaxaca, where one of the ladies who was managing the property just came by really quickly to me one day and very matter of fact, they said, hey, shall we put a chair in the downstairs shower so that it makes it easier for your brother to use, because we know that we don't have handholds in that shower. And she had just observed a need, very quickly proposed a solution, and then made it happen, simply without any further questions, and in a way that was deeply kind and observant. And I think that there are very much places like that make it easier and more joyful to travel, even when you need to pay attention to those constraints.
Thank you for sharing your experience on that front. On a topic that's related around like being able to pick the cities where one may want to go, how do you think about picking the right cities from balancing the different factors that make it an attractive, livable city, a place that fits your needs as a traveler? And I guess what's the process you go through? You mentioned you ask people who are like you, who may have experiences, but for you specifically, what framework do you use to say, all right, well, this is a good city for me, it matches my criteria, and or this one may not? And what methodology would you recommend others to use to be able to best make the most of the travel experience and this nomadic lifestyle, to make sure they're going to the right places that fit their needs and to have a great experience?
100%. I think the first thing is to have a really honest conversation with yourself about what you need, where you feel like you can compromise, and where you feel like you cannot compromise. I think that folks, sometimes we maybe get a little ambitious in our desires to travel to certain places, and maybe we overlook who we are at the core. And also, you, for example, know this about me already. I'm not a wilderness traveler. I am not an outdoorsy person. I'm not really trying to be ice climbing. I'm not really trying to mountaineer. I might go on like a gentle hike every now and again, but I am a city person through and through. I want to be in the center of, the 20 million person mega city. I want there to be life happening 24 hours a day. I want to be able to go out and sample all of these different cuisines, go to all of these cultural spaces, go and dance every night of the week if I feel so inspired. I need to know that about myself. So, when I keep that in mind, I'm like, okay, I'm probably not heading to Alaska first. That's probably not what I need to be doing. Think about other things. I don't drive and I do not enjoy driving. So I need to be looking for cities that have excellent public transit infrastructure, or I need to be looking for cities that have a great walking topography and that are, easy to get around and safe to get around on foot. I'm probably not spending a ton of time in Los Angeles, probably not spending a lot of time in Houston. Like I know that these are places that you have to have a car in order to make the most of your experience. So instead, I'm going to be prioritizing like a Copenhagen, or I'm going to be prioritizing, what's another place? Maybe like visiting a Japan, for example. Places where I know that there are really robust systems for being able to get around comfortably as a pedestrian or as a transit user. So I think making that list for yourself when you start the planning process to say, all right, so here's what I know about what I need to be comfortable. Let's just acknowledge that there's no shame in it. It's okay. Just write it down. And then when you look at a city, evaluate it against those points first to say, all right, like, am I going to find the things that I need to make my life comfortable? Yeah. Ask around those questions. You'll be on the Reddit forum, get into the solo travel subreddit, get onto the Girls Love Travel Facebook group, wherever it is that you have kind of trusted sources of travel information. Just ask them those questions honestly, see what people say, and then manage your expectations and your plan accordingly. And then I think, beyond those baseline needs, like what is it that makes me feel sort of safe and secure and able to live my day to day? Then also take the time to think about what you're excited to discover. Maybe what you would like to learn as you travel. One important framework for me over the last few years has been language learning. As I had started kind of deepening my desire to learn Spanish. And so I thought, all right, I want to be sure that I'm spending extended periods of time in cities where this language is spoken, so that every day my routines will force me to learn something new. Just, if I want to buy groceries, if I want to eat today, if I want to get from one side of town to the other, I'm going to have to use this language. If I want to meet people here, I'm going to have to use this language. So creating sort of an environment that makes it easier to accomplish the goals that you have, the things that you want to learn, the things that you're excited about, and kind of reducing the barriers for yourself wherever possible.
Great, thank you. That was very insightful. Now you got me thinking about which cities are a good match for the criteria that I care about. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's maybe shift gears a little bit and go back to you personally and your experience. I'm curious to hear about your perspective on how travel over the last few years and this nomadic lifestyle has changed you as a person. So when you think about Rachel from a few years ago versus Rachel today,
Mm-hmm.
how have you changed because of this experience over the last few years?
It's an intriguing question, and I know maybe this runs counter a little bit to what I was just saying about like forming your rubric and your criteria. But I think that one thing travel has done is make me more open, more flexible, and like made me realize I think I have like capacity to be comfortable in and adjust to a wider range of cultural contexts and experiences than I thought that I would when starting out. Because I have like some quite clear ideas of again who I am, what I enjoy, what I care most about, what's exciting. And I think that travel, and especially again, meeting people who live extraordinarily different lives and are willing to give me a window into them, has helped me to understand that, oh, I've got some more range than I thought. And one of these is actually the relationship to winter and weather. So, you know very well as somebody who was in Seattle for years about the intensity of getting through that winter season. It was the gray, the darkness, that kind of perpetual mist that never quite resolves into real rain, and how it transforms people's social behavior in that city as well. That we all sink into this hibernation, this retreating from a social life. There can be, I think, a light seasonal affective disorder that just impacts all of us. And it's something that I had a lot of resistance to and was one of the factors that compelled me to leave. I just thought, again, like I can't do this season anymore. It's so out of step with who I am and what I enjoy and how I like to spend my time in a city. Like the barriers that this raises for me to do the things that I know are healthy and bring me joy is just too high. Like I can't cope. So, I left and I'd been generally quite resolved to just not to be cold again. Like, you know what? Now I have the choice. Winter's a choice. I don't have to do this and I'm not going to. So I will run across the world. I will go to a whole Australia in order to avoid having to deal with this season. But last year, I spent a bit of time in Copenhagen and it was late October, early November. So definitely getting into the cold season. Like it's starting to get dark at 4:30 p.m. You got to be wearing fleece tights. I had to buy a pair of boots in Denmark because I didn't have them. I was freezing. But the way that they approached winter was very healthy in an interesting way. That was really a learning experience for me. They did not allow it to be an obstacle to enjoying the life of a city, to getting outside, to being active every day. They have this extraordinary cycling infrastructure, for example. So people are out every day on their bikes. Even in this cold weather, people are out walking every day. They just take the train into town and then explore the city on foot. They've layered appropriately. They got like the gloves and the hats and the boots and the tights. And then they're just taking advantage of the things the city has to offer. And they are intentional about gathering because we all know, the winter season can signal retreat for a lot of folks. So they make a point of having social spaces that are open after dark, cafes that are open late, restaurants that are open late, that people can come to from their homes where they are, gathering, they're made to feel welcome. Right, you can come and like bring your tea and bring your friends. You can be sitting for hours, be in conversation in a comfortable space. People are not pressuring you, to leave or to turn over. They do their best to make spaces outside still feel like home in some way. Or another thing I spotted was that nearly every place that I went to after dark, alongside electric light, had candles. And so as you're walking down the street, everything has got this like warm, inviting light and an energy that says, come in, like come sit down, eat something nice, like drink something warm, come hang out here all night if you'd like to. We're open, that's what we're here for. And it was a very healing experience when I thought about my relationship to the winter. I was like, oh, there are actually ways to do this that still center community. There are ways to do this that still allow for movement, that still allow for exploration. Like this season doesn't have to look one way. And I don't necessarily have to be so resistant to it or so avoidant of it. Like I could actually manage this. Now, could I manage it all season? Probably not. Am I going to be there for 6 months in the middle of the winter? Unlikely. But I think it was a very reassuring reminder that, oh, like you don't have to live this experience any one way. You can design it and design your environment to still be aligned with the things that you value, that are most important to you, even though the external circumstances seem like they might not be compatible initially. But I'm very grateful for that. I think it leads to a lot of ease and contentment while traveling, knowing that you have that capacity to stretch and to adapt to new environments.
Great. How do you feel, Rachel, about the prospect of traveling like this for a while versus eventually settling down somewhere, maybe in a cold weather place?
Oh, maybe the place.
Um, or in other words, how much longer do you think you live this kind of lifestyle? And how do you think about the potential options or places where you may decide to settle down, or the factors that may lead you to want to change the lifestyle you currently live?
So it's a very interesting question, and it's also a question that I get all the time, especially when people see, oh wow, you've been doing this for 2.5 years already. Aren't you tired? When do you think you're going to stop? Have you decided where you're going to settle down? And there are no concrete answers to that question yet, partly because I've had a really extraordinary time. I've enjoyed this shift in life so much. I do not miss having a single apartment. People are often like, oh, don't you miss your bed and your things and your kitchen? I do sometimes miss my spice cabinet. I would admit that. I do miss having like real hot sauce. Yes, true. But so few of those other things are important. Like when I think about what home is to me, home is very much my people. Where they are, where they're gathered, that is where I feel comfortable, that's where I feel at ease. And my people are everywhere in a very literal sense. It is hard to get away from them, frankly. I've barely ever been able to truly travel to a place alone because there's always a connection of some kind. There's a secret auntie, there's a friend of a friend, there's a long lost classmate, or a long lost housemate. It's really, really difficult for me to be alone. Really, I'd like to find solo time. And I'm really grateful for that because it makes this so much more sustainable. Because I know that, each new place in many ways is a homecoming. And I can land in Accra or Nairobi or Beijing or Los Angeles or Boston and be welcome and settle into a comfortable routine for as long as it is that I happen to be there and share the experience with people that I love dearly. So because those factors are in place, I think for me, the idea of like perpetual travel without a fixed end date, it's much more feasible, much more sustainable than it might be otherwise. I certainly make a little short list as I go to say, okay, now when I got to this city, like what was the feeling? How did it resonate? Could I see myself returning here for longer? Could I see myself making this maybe a base as a part of a rotation of cities? And there are a few that have risen to the top of that list. So I certainly keep that in mind to say if one day this energy changes, maybe I do feel tired. I like the idea of like, let me have a year in a place. Let me have 5 years in a place. Let's change this rhythm. That I know that sort of short list of places that would be very good options for that shift in lifestyle when the time came. And I continue to add to that list. I continue to refine those criteria. But there's no pressure, I think, to make that shift now. Every so often I sit down for a travel planning session and I'll be writing out, okay, what's coming over the next 6 months? What's coming over the next year? And I just keep writing. And 2027 has gone by, 2028 has gone by. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay. Well, I guess we're gonna keep going. There's so much more to see, there's so much more to do. Each place is also infinite in its depth, right? So you could spend years exploring a single country. And in all of this time, in all of this travel, I've only yet been to 35. So there's a lot more to go in terms of the breadth of future exploration. And that's a really exciting prospect. I think things that will change certainly include rhythm, as we've talked about before. I'll try and take a slower pace. So spend a few weeks in a single city instead of being in and out of there in a week or two. I do also want to invite people to share the experiences with more intention. So rather than being happily surprised when I get to a place and I find, there's a good friend who's also here, maybe making people aware of it early on at the beginning of a year, sharing, hey, here are some of the broad goals that I have for this coming year. If you've ever felt inspired to travel to this place, if you'd like to join me or gather somewhere, let's be proactive, let's organize and make that happen because that's a very nourishing part of the experience. So those things will shift. But I think the foundations of wanting to continue to be flexible, continue to be remote, continue rotating among bases and among cities where loved ones are, I think that's going to be a lifelong trend, and it will, the length of time and the places will shift, but the foundations are going to be consistent, I think.
Oh, wonderful. Sounds like an exciting plan.
It does.
I love it. Um,
That's true.
Rachel, is there anything else we haven't talked about you'd like to share? Any other advice you'd like to give people considering this kind of lifestyle?
Oh my goodness. I feel like we covered a breadth of topics, definitely. And so really I think the only advice is that if the circumstances allow it, to try. I think it is a really wonderful way to learn new things about yourself by getting to spend a bit more time with yourself. And again, like witnessing yourself in really different circumstances, really different cultural contexts, in different languages. There's some very powerful learning and discovery that can happen. And then it's so extraordinary in terms of the community building as well. Like to have the sense that home is literally everywhere is such a precious gift. So if that is, a possibility that you have the chance to explore, highly recommend.
100%. I think everybody who gets the opportunity to try it even for a few weeks or a few months, definitely worth kind of stepping outside the routine of the comfort zone,
Mm,
getting out there. There are so many places to see, so many people to meet, so many things to do, so many new experiences to be had. And yeah, life is so short, so you have to make the most of it while you're able to, while you can, while
exactly.
get the opportunity.
Mhm.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing your experience, for providing us with so many tips and advice. And I'm sure people listening or watching this would enjoy hearing about it all.
Thank you so much. It's always a joy for me to have these conversations and to try and be a conduit for information or resources or just that additional nudge to, get out and try it if you've been on the threshold but haven't taken the step. So thank you for creating the space as well.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to the SAFAROTO podcast and for taking the time to hear about Rachel and her story. So until next time, take care.